Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the final policy exchange event at this year's Conservative Party conference. We hope to have saved the best to last. My name is Dr. Paul Stott, and I will be chairing this meeting where we will consider how the Taliban's military victory in Afghanistan may impact us here in the United Kingdom. Does it give potential impetus to Islamist organisations and activists, adding momentum to a worldview that is often keen to stress that the West is in decline and that the answer to the world's problems is to be found in Islam, or perhaps more accurately, in their particular interpretation of it? Whilst the British far right appears to be weakest in terms of numbers and influence than for many decades, extremist groups do have a tendency to feed off one another. And as we saw in both Northern Ireland historically, and also after 9/11 and after 7/7, they will attempt to recruit on the basis of the other side's excesses. Those with memories of the last time that the Taliban were in power, in the period from 1996 to 2001, will recall that a small but perhaps not insignificant number of Britons travelled to Taliban-controlled territory, either out of feelings of religious and political solidarity, or in some cases to join up with armed jihadist groups operating on Taliban-controlled territory. Go through press articles in the late 1990s and the period up until the end of 2001, as I have in my own research, and you will find reports of Britons from towns such as Burnley, Leicester, Crawley, and from various London boroughs who died in that period fighting for the Taliban against the Northern Alliance, and equally fighting for Al-Qaeda against the Western forces. Why will this time be any different? Well, we have, I think, an expert panel to discuss these issues. Joining us remotely, we have Lord Carlile, former independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, and also Sir John Jenkins, senior fellow at Policy Exchange and a former UK ambassador to Saudi Arabia. On my left, we have Nusrat Ghani, the Conservative MP for Wealden, and a senior fellow at Policy Exchange. And on my right, the Right Honourable Damian Hinds, Minister for Security and Borders, and also Fiyaz Mughal, founder and director of the group Faith Matters. Before we hand over to our speakers, just a brief outline of the structure, the format that we will follow. I will invite each speaker to make a contribution, an opening statement of 3 to 4 minutes, and we will then have a panel discussion for approximately 15 minutes around some of the main themes to emerge. At approximately 6:35, 6:40 or so, I will throw proceedings open to the floor for a question and answer session. I would like to ask, please, that we have questions as opposed to statements. Now, knowing technology is always a gamble, I'd like to take, if I may, our two online speakers first. So could I perhaps ask Lord Carlile to make his contribution? Lord Carlile, I'm afraid we can't hear you at the moment. Could I ask you just to pause whilst we... Okay. Sir John Jenkins, please, whilst we're sorting... No, okay, we can't hear Sir John either. Last, my name's Lee, Nusrat Ghani, first among equals, sorry.
Thank you. I'm in the room, so hopefully the technology
Yes.
will work. Well, it's really great to be here, and congratulations for the Policy Exchange putting together such a stellar number of events, and I hope everyone will agree this will be the most important because it's international and domestic as well. The Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan was the Islamist hero hour. What happens in Afghanistan will not stay in Afghanistan, and it will impact our security here in the UK. The West's humiliating retreat from Afghanistan will have empowered radical Islamism here in the UK. And let me just try and explore 3 reasons. First, it shows those who hold radical beliefs that an alternative Islamist model is the one proposed to the Western liberal democracies is possible and gives us something to work towards and a dream to hold on to. And I must say, seeing the FCDO representation or delegation meeting the Taliban today, it seems as though the West is halfway doing their work, as unfortunately, Minister, there wasn't a single female in that delegation to represent the UK. The second, the Taliban's takeover in Afghanistan undermines our national security by creating the beginnings of a pariah state and an intelligence black hole. This may in turn see a resurgence of terrorism training camps and funding for extremist activities flowing out of Afghanistan and into various countries, including our own. Not necessarily in the hands of the Taliban, but from groups purporting to support them and the formation of an Islamic State. Third, if I may, the rise of the Taliban and their emergence in Afghanistan, I believe, will put pressure on other Islamic countries to backtrack on their desire to become more liberal in their versions of management or democracies, but also in the way that they allow minorities and women to take part in public service. My anxiety is, as the Taliban rises and tries to take hold of the perfect version of the Islamic State, other Muslim countries will have to legitimize their ability to hold guardianship of holy sites, and they may retreat from having arguments with the Taliban of what is and is not the appropriate version of an Islamic State, and how that impacts our security here will be absolutely key. If I have a few more moments, can I expand those arguments? The rise of the Taliban will be interpreted by many who can fall foul to extremism that Western democracies will always decline, that secular beliefs are not there for them, and when it comes to the 11th hour or the 12th hour, the only people you can rely on are those that claim to be a part of your faith and your community, and what we offer in the West is never for them in the long term. When I saw the American flight leave out of Kabul airport and saw the Afghan men running underneath it, or the Afghan men falling away from the flight, of course I thought it was a dreadful scene to watch, but I also thought this is the vision that will be played out again and again and again to promote extremism to young men, that when it comes to the crunch, the West has nothing to offer you. Unfortunately for us, it also means that we have fewer people on the ground to offer us intelligence when we need it to ensure that atrocities do not take place in the West as well. So I do think that extremism will be on the rise, and I am fair that the policies that we have at the moment to deal with terrorism may not be fit for purpose unless we upgrade them and reevaluate them to understand what it means to have an actual state in place that could be promoting extremism domestically and also over here in the UK. My second point about counter-terrorism issues arise from the Taliban-ruled Afghanistan. And fundamentally, I'm concerned about an intelligence black hole and the possibilities of new terrorist training camps being set up in Afghanistan and spilling out over into other regions. It doesn't cost a huge amount of money to fly to Pakistan, let alone Afghanistan. So we're in a very unique position compared to America. And we also have a very unique history when it comes to young British men and women being brainwashed into taking part in extremism activities here and overseas. But considering that many would argue in Afghanistan that we have abandoned our translators, our embassy guards, our local guides, the 69 female MPs, I'm not sure who we can rely on going forward to offer us the intelligence that we need to ensure that security here in the UK continues to remain safe. I was recently at an event, at a 9/11 event, which was reflecting on the last 20 years since 9/11. And we did this with the shadow of the Taliban once again taking hold in Afghanistan. We were trying to be positive and optimistic in how much we have learned since 9/11. But unfortunately for many people present, there was a feeling that the American version of war on terror hasn't ended but may begin again. That once again we will have a confrontational, challenging exchange of extremism versus our Western values and our way of life. And the struggle that we thought was diminishing will once again emerge, and we will have to put all of our resources in understanding, undermining and banishing extremism, not only in Afghanistan but here in the UK too. And my final point, if I may, example. Since 9/11, I don't think we ever understood what it meant for Muslims and the rest of the Islamic world when it comes to extremism and defending and defeating extremism. And we must try and understand that many Muslims and many people in the Islamic world also feel deeply wounded by the rise of extremism. And I hope that this time round we can work with our partners in the West and the East to ensure that we're fighting the right enemy, that is Islamist extremism, and not undermining liberal Muslims and those states that are trying to become more liberal in their governance too. I think I've done more than my allocated few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Nusrat. Okay. Hopefully now the online technology is with us. Could I ask Lord Carlile to make his contribution, please?
Can I make sure that you can hear me? Can you hear me? Yes. Very good. Right. Well, in answer to the first question I was asked, which is whether the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan gives momentum to Islamist organizations and activists in the UK, the answer is broadly yes. But I don't think it's got anything hugely to do with the Taliban, except the fact that Afghanistan now becomes an ungoverned space. It's a very big country. It's got a large population. It's difficult to penetrate. And therefore, it will become an ungoverned space in the hills of which there will be opportunities for terrorist cells to develop and grow. There's nothing new about this. There are historical precedents for it. The evidence is overwhelming. As to whether it will give momentum to Islamist organizations and activists in the UK, well, yes, it could. But my view is that it is more likely to give momentum to Islamist terrorism in the European Union than in the UK. And that is simply because of the Schengen borders and also of the very strict controls there are in the United Kingdom on the use of the possession and use of firearms. But nevertheless, we must be eternally vigilant because the risk arises. The second question I was asked is, how do we prevent the type of engagement between British extremists of the Taliban and Britons and foreign fighters the Taliban hosts, which characterized the period 1996 to 2001? Well, I think the answer to that is, to begin with, we have to ensure that there is the best quality intelligence available. I don't believe that intelligence will be unavailable in Afghanistan. There are so many different ways of gathering what is converted into intelligence nowadays, and I won't go into all the details of it, but I think there will be a great deal of intelligence. And what I would say to the government is that they must do everything they can to ensure that the intelligence agencies and ultimately the police, working in partnership with the Ministry of Defense and the Foreign Office, should ensure that the intelligence is capable of being fully analyzed and therefore deployed operationally when it comes to countering foreign terrorist fighters who may have been trained by the not by the Taliban, but in Afghanistan. The third risk, as I see it, is that people who get their inspiration from the internet, and there are many, and they're very seldom accurately described as lone actors because they're acting with that inspiration that they derive from the internet, will be encouraged by what has happened in Afghanistan. Some of it is caused by theology, though I'm very dubious myself as to the genuineness of any theology. Fiyaz, who I respect enormously, may have a comment to make on this later. But I think that there is theological heresy, which is quite different from theology, which will potentiate irresponsible and foolish, mostly young men who, sitting in their homes, maybe in the United Kingdom, maybe elsewhere in Europe, will feel that they should become what is sometimes called lone actors. And the real danger they present is high. Look at what happened with the use of a single lorry in Nice not so long ago. an additional factor I would like to mention is about the way in which we deal with extremism. And there's an awful lot I could say about extremism, but I will pick on one point. The way we deal with extremism in British prisons, it remains unsatisfactory. We have not created a methodology which enables us to know, first of all, how to deal with extremism in British prisons. Also, it doesn't enable us to know, even if we know how to deal with extremism, whom we have been successful with. The case of Usman Khan is a parable of what should not occur. And it's important to say about Usman Khan's case, the fishmonger's hall bomber, that the people who thought that he was a reformed character were honest, decent, hardworking, analytical academics from very good universities, but they got it wrong. And if ever there was a case that shows that there is much more work to be done to deal with extremism, that is it. I do not believe that crudely increasing prison sentences to extreme lengths actually does the trick necessarily, because you punish the good because of the bad, and that creates bad, particularly in the atmosphere of prisons. Prisons are the most boring places to be on earth, and any activity, including being radicalized, stimulates the young men who are there. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on that front. Will that do for now?
Thank you very much. Round of applause for Carlile. Thank you. Could I ask Sir John Jenkins to speak, please?
Can you hear me, Paul?
Yes, loud and clear.
Fantastic. I'm going to be very boring and say I agree with much of what both Nusrat Ghani and Alex Carlile have just said. I think the impact of the Taliban, or the apparent Taliban victory in Afghanistan, I say apparent because it remains to be seen whether they can actually exert what we would consider to be full control over the entirety of the Afghan national territory. I think the impact is actually is real, but is complex. One of the things we saw when after the fall of Kabul was an explosion of triumphalist responses on Twitter and other forms of social media from Islamists and their allies and Islamist adjacent people in the UK, in Europe and elsewhere. And this, one of the abiding elements of Islamist narratives, and this goes back at least to the 1950s in Egypt, when the Muslim Brotherhood was suppressed by Nasser after '54, is that repression and defeat are signs of a divine test. I mean, Fiyaz will know about this. And in Arabic, it's called mihna. So you have a time of mihna. And this is a test by God to determine if you are sufficiently committed to the cause to persevere. This narrative fits onto traditional narratives arising from the foundation of Islam. What happened with the Prophet and his companions after the expulsion from Mecca, their settling in Medina, and their return in triumph. And this is a sort of circular narrative. We are tested, we win, we lose, we are tested, and we win again. So defeat is always precursor to victory. We've seen this not just with the Taliban. We saw it, as I said, with the Brotherhood in Egypt in 1950. We saw it actually with the Brotherhood very distinctly in Egypt and elsewhere after 2011, between 2011 and 2013. The crushing by the Egyptian military of the Brotherhood and their associates in Rabia Square and elsewhere was seen in this context, and that's the way a lot of Islamists are interpreting this. They're interpreting this as a reward for steadfastness in the face of a historical and divine test. That gives inspiration. It gives comfort. to Islamists. It doesn't directly give them a helping hand, but it confirms them that what they're doing is right. And we can't just look at the Taliban in isolation. If you think about what's happening in Afghanistan, the Islamic State, or elements of the Islamic State of Khorasan are present in Afghanistan and are already conducting. It's interesting what's happening because they and the Taliban are likely to end up fighting each other. We're already seeing signs of that. Al-Qaeda are more closely associated with the Taliban. Of course, it was Al-Qaeda's association with the Taliban in 2001 that led to the overthrow of the Taliban regime the first time. But they're also present, and I think the links between them and the Haqqani network with the Taliban are of particular concern. But we must also remember that the Islamic State remain present in large parts of Iraq and Syria, that they have franchised their ideology and their activities and their networks into significant parts of Africa, Southeast Asia. So the threat from activist forms of jihadi Islamism, and a lot of these organizations, I mean, they're not all the same. I think we need to say that they're not all the same. Is present, and it's not just the Taliban. I think in terms of what you do about this, I think as Alice Carlile said, I mean, the real answer, as always, is intelligence. Having a robust, accurate, timely, and operational intelligence network. Do we have that? I simply don't know. I think one of the things we saw after the withdrawal of most of the US forces from Baghdad, from Iraq, after 2011, is the sudden collapse of large parts of what had been an extremely effective intelligence gathering operation, and a lot of that was to do with the loss of technical facilities. You can do a certain amount with human intelligence. You can do a lot more if you've got human intelligence. You've got human plus electronic intelligence and other forms of intelligence gathering. I just don't know if we have all that at the moment. I think just finally, there is also a particular threat, it seems to me, from the victory of the Taliban in Afghanistan to Pakistan. I think the whole issue of what happens now to the Tehreek Taliban Pakistan, which of course have caused the government in Islamabad huge problems in the past, I think is an open question. I'd be very interested to hear what Fiyaz says about this. And of course, that also depends on how we construe Pakistan, friend or foe or somewhere in between. And I'll shut up there.
Thank you, Sir John. Fiyaz, various speakers have billed you there, so over to you.
Fantastic. Well, it's fantastic, but it's a very difficult show to follow after all these speakers. So let me just also kind of pick up on three things that Nusrat, Lord Carlile and Sir John Jenkins have said. First of all, Nusrat's absolutely right, is the war on extremism, whatever you want to call it, actually involves Muslim communities in that battle. So it's a really important point to make because mistakes were made, and those mistakes actually cost a lot of goodwill that could have come from Muslim communities. The second thing Lord Carlile said around theological heresy as drawing in lone actors is absolutely right. If you look at the theological history and background of Islam, there is a lot of nuance, there's a lot of contextual history there, which actually is a major or set of rebuttal points against extremism. So the theological heresy is an easy way, the twisting, the contorting is an easy way, the simplifying of Islamic dialogue and theological elements is a simple way to draw in individuals. So he's absolutely right on that. And Sir John Jenkins on Pakistan, absolutely. I think Pakistan and its inter-services intelligence agencies may be smiling, but they won't be smiling for long because there are a number of Islamist groups that will be inspired in Pakistan, and those networks are growing robust and very strong. If you look at the Islamist groups in Pakistan, they managed to shut down Islamabad 3-4 years ago. The government was giving money through its military sources to try to get them off the streets. Pakistan is at the behest of these groups. Okay, so Imran Khan can say what he wants, but he is held on the coals by these Islamist groups in the political arena and in terms of areas like the federally administered tribal areas in the northwest of the country. So Pakistan is in serious trouble in relation to its future with the Taliban on its borders. But I just want to go back to the local context of Afghanistan and the UK. You know, I was born in East Africa, so the Islam I knew was a Sufi influenced East African Islam, which was open, outwardly looking, influenced by a whole variety of Islamic traditions. But I remember coming to the UK in 1981. I'm one of the Ugandan Asians who was kicked out, but I lived in Kenya, came here in 81, and grew up ever since. But I remember the first time I came across leaflets was around 84, 85 at a local mosque. And those leaflets were being handed out and circulated quite widely, and they consistently had pictures of dead Russians on them. And they consistently had material showing that jihad and the struggle against effectively the heathens in Russia was a global struggle using military and theological means. So in other words, this global jihadism had taken root and was also, the leaflets and the material was being circulated around some of the mosques in the mid-80s, here in the UK. So the inspiration of what happened in Afghanistan, i.e. the Russian booting out of the Russians, was creating an inspiration, an Islamist inspiration, and a cycle of and a circle of their distribution networks here in the UK. And it's also important to state the kind of historical element that a lot of diaspora Muslims at that moment in time were looking to have a space for their identity in this country. So coming here, they were forming their identities. You know, the sense of dislocation, the sense of coming to a new culture, the sense of coming to a new space, the climate was inherently different. Many different complicating factors around identity. And so for many of them, the sense of the Russians being kicked out, and in a way Afghanistan going back to an Islamic tradition, was a sense of inspiration for many Muslims. But that's different to what Islamists did with that inspiration. It's very important to make a distinction. What Islamists did with that inspiration was to actually say, as was mentioned earlier, I think Nusrat mentioned it, was actually to take inspiration that a new form of a political framework of Islam can actually be victorious, and to turn it into a political and militaristic sense of victory. And it goes back to what Sir John Jenkins was saying, that actually there is this cycle of loss and victory, which is part of Islamic heritage, that Islamists play on. That through defeat, we will eventually find victory. And that is distinctly different to what a lot of Muslims feel and think. They don't want victory, they just want to get on in this country. They want to have successful lives, they want the same things for their kids as anyone else. So you can clearly see a distinguishing factor in how Islamists have pushed their narrative in some of the circles in this country. And so really, we're looking at a sense of energization, if I can say, kind of a real sense of energy coming in after the Russians were kicked out, which has also been refelt after the Taliban takeover. It is not to that heightened degree, but it is coming back in. Let me give you some examples. I'm going to give you examples of some activists in circles in British Muslim communities. And again, vast majority of British Muslim communities don't believe in this ideology and this sentiment, but I'm going to read out some of the activists who are shouting out the ladders. So somebody says here on social media, these people have lots of social media followers, many of them based in the UK. He says, whatever you think of the Taliban, their seemingly imminent victory is a historic defeat of colonialism and imperialism. You're starting to see how they're bringing that into the narrative. Okay? They're bringing in this version that actually not only has there been a defeat and that Islamism is the way forward, but we have defeated the colonialists and imperialists, as if the rest of the Afghans who are involved with making their country open and somewhat democratic are suddenly part of the colonial empire. And so it then goes on to say, this is a person who lives in London. He says, this should be the main narrative of media around the world rather than the red herrings about women's rights. So this is a person living here, enjoying our rights, and basically completely disregarding the rights of half of the population in Afghanistan. Can you see the perversity of this? The utter perversity. We then go to another very strong commentator in British Muslim communities, very loud voice, who says, listen to this, basically blamed the US and ISAF allies for creating panic and fear rather than heeding the Taliban's general amnesty when people were flocking to the airport. He suggests that was because the US and ISAF and the US and the UK, rather, were creating a sense of fear instead of trusting the Taliban, and so people were running to the airports, so the blame lies on the US and the UK. Can you see the utter perversity of this? Instead of the reality being people were fleeing from a bunch of barbarians who were trying to bring in a medievalist form of their interpretation of Islam into Afghanistan. So what he's doing is blaming the US and UK. This is an individual who's got quite a voice in sections of the community, whose group effectively is platformed in universities. Okay? And this person knows exactly what they're doing. So the US and the UK become the enemy. He lives here in the UK. And actually the reality is it's the West's fault people ran to the airport. Nothing to do with the Taliban. I'm just going to give you two more statements, because what I'm trying to show you is exactly the impact here in the UK, which is distinctive and dangerous. Okay? So, here goes another one. Here's an individual who's a journalist and who's been associated with Iranian-backed Press TV. Right? Goes on to say, as far as I'm aware, the biggest news network in Afghanistan is Tolo News and is funded by the US government. But the Islamic Emirate, I'd hardly call them that, obviously cannot allow the biggest opinion former in the country to be influenced by a hostile nation, thereby suggesting this journalist that press outlet should be shut down. What kind of journalist is this? But he has a standing and he has a voice in parts of the community. He then goes on to say, listen to this. This was after the killing of 10 individuals, which was a reaction by the US done after the terrorist bombing of about 100 plus individuals who died, waiting to get out of the country, right? So the US makes a mistake in its intelligence and 10 people died. And what does he say? This is the journalist here, says, the US government are nothing but murderers. May they be expelled from every Muslim nation. Now this, I can go on and on and on, as Sir John Jenkins said, as to the social media output that's been pouring out from some of these accounts targeted at British Muslim communities. And the fact is we have a battle on our hands. And that battle is to tackle the ideology of Islamist extremism. That battle is to win hearts and minds. And that battle is to reduce the impact of what the Taliban takeover has done. The energization, this kind of sense of energy has to be limited. And we need to take this battle on. I'm sad to say that Brexit and all of the other problems we've had in our country have taken the eye off the ball because ministers, government have been so focused on trying to deal with so many issues. But we must get our eye back on the ball, because in the end, as Nusrat said, we have exported some of the worst jihadis that the world has seen. We've exported them to Israel, we've exported them to other parts of the Middle East, to North Africa, and frankly, enough is enough.
Thank you, Fiyaz. Damian Hinds.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Can I just say at the start, as Nuz did, congratulations to Policy Exchange on a truly remarkable programme of events that you've run through this conference, leading the policy debate. And this panel, wow, what a rich and insightful discussion. And it's a pleasure to be able to join you up here for it. Look, I've been Security Minister for a few weeks now, and the first thing you were reminded of coming into this role is that the threat of a terrorist attack is ever present. It doesn't go away then to come back. It is always with us, and as we sit here today, the official alert level remains at substantial, meaning an attack is likely, and that is borne out in the number of disruptions that there have been of late stage disruptions of attacks, even since the horrors of 2017. And of course, we've just had a period of time because of the coronavirus, which has been unusual in this way, as in so many other ways, so many other parts of life, because activity has been suppressed because there haven't been, gatherings of large people in the same way that there would be ordinarily. There have been, of course, large numbers of people spending large amounts of time behind their computer screens during this period. And so, we need to be ever vigilant. Let me say a thing briefly, if I may, about the trends that we see in the terror threat. There's this move, and it's been alluded to already, from what are called directed attacks to, and I don't like the word, but inspired attacks, meaning you're right that they're not usually entirely lone operators, though it's possible to be, but who don't require a sort of chain of command that goes all the way up to somebody running a global terror organisation, and as was alluded to by Sir John, can also be done in a quite a sort of low-tech kind of way. The other sort can still exist too, the directed sort, but this self-initiated attack and activity it has been a growth area. The second trend is about linked with mental health issues, and in truth that was probably always there, but we're more aware of it now than ever before. The third is about diversification of threats. So extremist, Islamist is still the biggest single group, but actually there has been this growth in extreme right-wing terrorism-minded people as well as some other sort of single issue and other particular ideologies. And the fourth, and I think Fiyaz really illustrated this extremely well, is about the role of the internet. And the internet has changed just about everything in our lives, and it has certainly changed, I'm afraid, the terror arena as well in three ways. First, the propaganda, which, I think, you articulated extremely powerfully how that can be done. But also the wherewithal, the giving the access to instructions for how to perpetrate harm on a large scale. And third, finding like-minded people. So these days, you're only a log on away from finding somebody somewhere in the world who shares your view of the world, and they will be there somewhere. Turning specifically to Afghanistan, and may I first just say again, pay tribute to all those British forces who fought in Afghanistan over the years, in particular the 457 who paid the ultimate price, and then the far many more, of course, who sustained life-changing injuries. It shouldn't be underestimated what they achieved. For a start, we've had 20 years of not having an entire large country as a safe haven for Al-Qaeda, and of course, going back to 2001, that was precisely the impetus for going there in the first place. It's difficult, it's impossible actually to say how many lives that can have saved, but it is potentially very, very large indeed. And of course, domestically, there has been a whole generation in Afghanistan who has come through under a better regime, and we get to the point where 3.6 million girls were going to school. Then Operation Pitting, of course, the movement of people from Afghanistan, the evacuation, was an exercise on an unprecedented scale. Now, what happens next in Afghanistan remains to be seen to some extent. There have been these proclamations on women at work and girls at school, and you cannot know exactly what that means and where it will end. And as I think it was Sir John earlier, or Lord Carlile was saying, we must remember that you're not dealing with one person when you talk about the Taliban. Like when you talk about a political party or any group, there are a range of views, and we know there are the more hard line and the less hard line. There are the younger versus the older. There's the more the rural versus the slightly more urbanized, and so on. And all these can have different impacts. Of course, there are also some pressures on the regime, who will want international recognition, and for whom international development spending is very important. So I don't think it's not that the Taliban takeover creates a threat. The threat is always there, but bad people who seek to radicalise, to draw in others to their cause, will always seize on whatever is the event, is the situation that can be twisted to their ends, and that is certainly the case with Afghanistan. And again, as Fiyaz, I think, very lucidly put it, there is at its core, a straightforward picture they would want to present. And so I think this makes our approach to counter-extremism, counter-terrorism more important than ever. So you may know there's this, in the contest strategy, there are 4 elements: prevent, protect, prepare and pursue. And pursue is the one which I suppose is the sort of highest profile. It's going after people and making sure they go through the criminal justice system. And we have some fantastic people working in. It's one of the great privileges actually of my job, is to get to meet some of them who are working in the agencies and in law enforcement to make that happen, and working together across organisations effectively. And we have more tools at our disposal now in terms of temporary exclusion orders and TPIMs and different ways of disrupting activity. We've been consulting about a protect duty on people who own and run public spaces, whether that's venues or the spaces around them, to prepare to defend for potential attack and to deter it. But actually, it's what we call, you might call the upstream end. Prevent actually is the most important. It's the highest volume, and it's where you have the chance, literally, to prevent people being sucked in to that system at all. Essentially, it's about supporting vulnerable people to show them an alternative. Sometimes that's about religious discussion and the true meaning of Islam. Sometimes it's about making sure that people just have purposeful things in their lives. It's about role models and about the full range of interventions that can be made. And the prevent duty, as draws together local authorities, education institutions, health, prisons and probation. And I think it was a really important point that came up earlier. I think I imagine we'll come back to it in discussion. And so, we work at scale with community organisations to reach actually very large numbers of people in one way or another, both individuals themselves, but also those who can be working with them, and quite a number also go through the specific channel programme of individual interventions. So, look, I look forward to the discussion here today. It's right that we talk about Afghanistan. It's right that we talk about the immediate here and now. But we must remember that whatever happens in Afghanistan, I'm afraid the reality of the last decades, and it's going to be with us for some time, is that there will be people always who will seek to twist the reality of the world into their chosen narrative. The medium of the internet lets you do that on a scale and with a reach that none of us have known in our lives hitherto, and our defences against these things have never been more important.
Thank you. Okay, I'm conscious that we've packed a lot in and still have more to come. Before I go on to the Q&A, I think Nuz, you had a point to make. I'd just like to hear a little bit more from the panellists in terms of what they've heard from their colleagues so far.
There's been such a depth of conversation that's taken place already. My anxiety is that we're just not accepting the reality of what's taking place. I do not doubt that terrorism evolves, and we're always trying to tackle individuals, institutions, or organisations on the dark web. But the Taliban aren't hiding on the internet. We know exactly what they are. We know exactly what they believe in. They are absolutely determined to create an Islamic state, and anyone that opposes them has to be undermined and defeated. If we know that is the terms of the game, I find it remarkable that we cannot accept that everything that they stand for is the exact opposite of everything that we stand for, which is stability, security, liberal democracy, and the rights for minorities, women, men, and children. And to talk about the good guys and the bad guys, it's very clear who the bad guys are. And if we're going to try and nuance what the Taliban stand for, considering they now run Afghanistan, we are not going to have a hope in hell in trying to challenge extremist values by trying, some way we're trying to explain away there is something appropriate in anything that they stand for, and we must never even start that conversation. And what's extraordinary about the Taliban's re-emergence in Afghanistan, unlike any other Islamic country, they can fly the flag that they are not corrupted by Western alliances and Western values. They are the purest form of Islam. So for young men who do not feel they need to compromise to our values or to Western standards of living, will always be attracted to the Taliban. And my anxiety from what I've heard here today is that somewhere, somehow, we can meet a halfway with the Taliban. We can't. We are an abomination. The 69 female MPs that I've been trying to get out of Afghanistan alive, it's not because of any personal gain. Those are the women, those are the voices that will undermine the Taliban the most. Female Muslim women who've experienced them previously for 17 years and again, but they are an abomination to the Taliban. And those are the women and those are the experiences we should be promoting, and we should not be trying to carve out the good version of the Taliban that isn't. They are the enemy of the state, our state.
Thank you, Nuz. Hopefully we still have our two online contributors with us. Lord Carlile, please.
Yeah, like Nusrat Ghani, I deplore what the Taliban have been doing, and particularly their attitude towards women, and also their attitude towards the judiciary, which has acted honourably and honestly during the last 20 years. But I have to say that I'm not as pessimistic as you. My view is that the Taliban are largely naive. They're mostly people from country areas who do not understand economics. From what I've seen of the Taliban, they only have one respectable economist working for them. There is opposition to the Taliban in Afghanistan. They are not competent, and they are going to lead to economic disaster in Afghanistan, and particularly to poverty and deprivation. So they're not going to have it all their own way. Furthermore, I do believe that we have to be realistic about the Taliban. We may not recognize them as a government with a capital G, but we're going to have to recognize them as the de facto government of Afghanistan, at least for the time being, and we may have to do some sort of business with them. The business we do with them has many levers, including the way in which aid is provided, even for the relief of poverty, which I think, as far as is possible, we would like to continue. So I do think there are levers. I do think they're going to come and recognize that they need to behave quite differently from the way they behaved before 2001. And there are some interlocutors in the Gulf region, not least the government of Qatar, who are making earnest efforts, very difficult efforts, and doing it, in my view, honorably, to try and ensure that there is a dose of reality imposed upon the Taliban.
Thank you. Sir John Jenkins, you've obviously worked at the coalface for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in the past. How do we deal with these types of actors? What should our approach be?
I'm not sure I'd call it the coalface, Paul. I don't think the people who lead the Taliban are that naive. I think they know perfectly well what the rest of the world is like. They've been around a long time. I mean, there are people still like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who is still around, who of course was one of the most vicious of all the Mujahideen leaders in the 1980s, and has a particularly close relationship with Iran. I think it'd be interesting to see what happens with the relationship the Taliban seek to establish with their neighbouring states. I mean, clearly the relationship with Pakistan is massively important, particularly with the ISI. Whatever the National Security Advisor of Pakistan said at Policy Exchange last month, when that relationship has been close since the 1980s, and it remains. And I think there are real risks for Pakistan in this. I think there are risks for Iran. We know that the Iranians were helping the Taliban nearly 20 years ago against coalition forces in Afghanistan. They were doing it because my enemy's enemy is my enemy. I mean, there was a lot of that going on at the time. There still is. I think there is the attempts that the Tehran have made to reach out to the Taliban have been rebuffed. I think there is a fundamental disconnect between the Taliban, which is a Deobandi Hanafi Islamist movement, and the Iranian regime, which is a Shia Islamist movement. And I think I think there will be severe regional tension. I'm not sure what role we have in this at the moment. I mean, since we and the Americans and various others say that the real threat is in the South China Sea, and the threat in Europe, of course, is from Russia. I mean, there's a bit of me that thinks, well, let him get on with it. I think the issue of supplying development assistance to the Taliban is really, really problematic through the Taliban, because we've seen this in different circumstances in Syria, where the government, the Assad regime, has insisted on all UN assistance, which is basically assistance, going through the Assad regime, and they've stolen half of it. And I think that would happen in Afghanistan as well. I mean, Nusrat's point about what you do about those who suffer under Taliban rule, and if you look at what polling there has been over the last sort of 6 months or so, there was a significant, perhaps a majority tendency in Afghanistan who reject the Taliban, but can't do anything about them because they have the physical control of the country. Whether you can find ways of supporting them, I don't know. But I'm sceptical. And as for the Ghataris, I mean, as some people will know, including many of my friends in the Gulf, I'm not a great fan of what the Ghataris have done in the Gulf, in Lebanon, in Yemen, or indeed with the Taliban. I think a lot of it is self-interested, and I think a lot of it is bigged up for show. It's an avenue of some sort, but I'm on the highly sceptical side of all of this.
Thank you, Sir John. We've touched in the last couple of contributions on the sort of the international aspect and what the government may do internationally. But Fiyaz was in his contribution talking about some of the, if you like, pro-Taliban voices we hear within the UK, and I just wonder, Damian Hinds, whose job is it to counter those voices, and what we should be doing?
Well, I mean, it's an incredibly important point. I mean, I suppose the answer may sound like a cop-out, but the answer is it's for all of us, actually, to counter, but particularly for trusted voices in communities. Generally speaking, the government trying to counter such messages doesn't land well. I mean, for obvious reasons, and that's why it's so important to work in partnership with those who do have trusted voices, and particularly within faith communities. But that's not to, government clearly has a role in that as well, and making sure that there are spaces for those discussions and being very, being supportive of that kind of community action. But we all have a part to play.
Okay, we can run slightly over time, so there will be Q&A. But Fiyaz, I must allow you to respond.
So thank you. I cannot underscore. So the first thing I need to say, I take the same position as Nusrat on the Taliban. Let's never forget two things the Taliban have been involved with. So they have a track record. This is not just a one-off. The first thing they did is President Najibullah, who was the Soviet-backed ruler of Afghanistan, had taken sanctity in a diplomatic residence in the mid-90s. What the Taliban did is they dragged him out of that diplomatic residence and strung his body up and split it into different bits. These are the barbarians we are talking about here. There's no diplomatic sense. They'll play the game. Take it from me, I've lived a lot of this experience of the Islamist networks in Britain. They are savvy. They are very savvy, and I'll come back to the second point of why they're so savvy. First thing was that. The second thing is, why did we go to war? Because they gave support to bin Laden and his network. Yeah. Never forget that premise. That these guys, on multiple fronts, are what we call chancers. And I was taught by my parents, once you come across chancers, they don't really change. Okay, so I'll leave it at that. I fully back Nusrat in her position on this. And these are coming from two members of the Muslim community, British Muslim community, telling you these are bad dudes. Sorry to use the term of a George Bush type rhetoric, but I'm going to go back to the days when he was on the telly. They're bad dudes, right? So the second thing I'm going to say in this is that the Islamist network is well developed in the UK. Let me tell you how I've experienced it working with government over the last 15 years, and I put my head down because I frankly kind of had enough of it, the Islamist network, is they go after anyone who challenges them. They tear them down in social media. They come together and they network together. They try to find leaks in the government through some civil servants who've leaked information before. I'm just raising it with the minister. And that has been used and targeted against British Muslim activists who work with this government. And they have actively torn down individuals and mentally affected them and gone after their parents because they have a network. And this is what the British government doesn't realise. Many of us have been saying it for years. There is an active network taking down people who are working with you. So the response that actually it is for all of us, I say it is the government's response should be, how do we support those people who work with us? How do we support those projects working with us who are actively abused on social media, who are actively targeted, whose projects are smeared? And that's been going on for decades. Most of them are British Muslim women, by the way, who are smeared, going back to what Nusrat is saying. So people like Nusrat are attacked. People in civil society organisations are attacked. We must not forget the coordinated fashion of the Islamist network in the UK. It is not the whole of the British Muslim community who want to get on with their lives. It is a small, organised and very driven network.
I'm conscious as chair I've slightly neglected perhaps the audience today, so rapid questions please. Can I take two at a time? Okay, gentleman at the back and then the gentleman in the grey jacket. Hello, sir.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try not to make a statement, but I do want to thank everyone on the panel and the people here for the contribution. It's been very interesting. My name's Councillor Mudassir Dean, and I'm the Cabinet Member for Stronger Communities and Policing in Bolton. I would like to ask a question around the justice system and keep it short as well. Do you think the justice system is fair? There are tweaks that need to be made in other areas of working with communities, but do you think the justice system is robust and strong enough for us to go in the right direction?
Thank you, sir. Gentleman here in the grey jacket.
Yeah. What measures?
Could you just hold on 1 second?
Yeah.
Thank you.
What measures would the panel like to see this government and the West in general take to bring about the swift destruction of the Taliban?
Okay. First question on is the criminal justice system fair? We should probably start with the security minister on that one.
Well, look, yes, you know, we have a world-leading justice system. I think we need to be very vigilant about some of the aspects of the criminal justice system end to end, if you see what I mean, and particularly that period, and we talked about it a few times, when people are in prison and also when they have been released in the probation service. And clearly, these are very, very sensitive, highly leveraged, whatever phrase you want to use times and people to be dealing with. So I think that requires our constant vigilance. Did you want me to deal with the other question at the same time?
Very briefly, if you want to. Yes.
I mean, on the question. So, of course, that is what happened 20 years ago. And, so you say, I'd be really straightforward with you and say, I don't have an answer for you for how you would, how one would have done that differently at the time. And I absolutely don't want to make any excuses or, mealy-mouthed words or anything like that. An awful lot of... clearly an awful lot of effort and great number of sacrifices have been made by men and women from our country and others in Afghanistan.
Could I just bring in Lord Carlile on that legal question which was asked as to whether the criminal justice system's fair, whether we have the laws that we need?
Well, I don't know what is meant by the criminal justice system. The trial system is certainly fair. Cases are prosecuted well. On the whole, they're defended well, and the judges understand what they're doing. Whether it's effective may be quite a different question. I raised earlier the effectiveness of desistance and disengagement schemes in prisons. We will be hearing and seeing a report on Prevent by William Shawcross, I believe, in early November. And I look forward to that because I think the Prevent system works tolerably well, but it's capable of significant improvement and reorganization. On what measures we should take, I think that I repeat what I said earlier and Sir John mentioned earlier about quality of intelligence. I think we should destroy the cells that create terrorism by making them incapable of operation. I think that preventing them in the broadest sense from developing is much more effective than the odd criminal trial, though criminal trials with serious sentences at the end of them do play a part.
Thank you. Naz, I think you wanted to say something there.
Well, I'm hoping that maybe Modesta's point was about potentially what happens within prison. And I think there's a tremendous work to be done to try and educate and train individuals that enter prison and may be prone to being brainwashed into becoming extremists. And we do know that they may have a lower level of education and may have issues then what they think that their future holds outside of prison. And I think a huge amount of work will have to be done there. When it comes to trying to undermine the Taliban, it took 17 years last time, and my argument would be, let's just try and keep alive the people that matter. Those are the female MPs. Those are the judges that practice common law. Those are the headmistresses that are now being told that they will be killed unless they can leave. They will be the most authentic voices to take down the ideology of the Taliban. It won't be any white Western leader. It will be Muslim voices and fundamentally female Muslim voices. So we should be prioritizing with our partners, the French and Americans in particular, and just keeping them alive. So when the time is right that they can go back home and dismantle the nonsense the Taliban put in place, we need to suck it up and start establishing relationships with people around the world that we were uncomfortable with having relationships with, Pakistan being in particular. They've had Taliban on their doorstep. Whatever we think about them in the past, they will have the best knowledge in trying to push them back. They've defeated them once, they'll have to do that again. And then my final plea is this to anybody in government. Do not undermine who we are when we are interacting with the Taliban. And today was a shameful exercise when the FCDO had a meeting with the Taliban and not a single woman was present. There are enough women with enough caliber to be at these meetings.
Thank you. I'm conscious the time's very much against us. Could I have 2 rapid-fire questions to finish? So I think you had your hand up, and then I'll take the gentleman here in the T-shirts. Quickly, please, sir.
Good evening, sir. I'm Shah Niraz, and I was responsible for delivering Prevent. And like Lord Carlile, it was effective, it was useful. But in 2011, when the coalition government came into power, under the name of cross-cutting review, saving funds for local government, those who were at the forefront delivering and taking the challenges left behind, and we had to face all the difficulties, harassment and so on, what Fiyaz said. But my question is, in 20 years ago, we went together with America, and it seems to me that Mr. Trump made a deal, America left. Where do we stand, and how about our, what about future security threat that we may face?
Okay.
Thank you.
Sir. Very quickly, please.
Thank you. Obviously, a reason for going into Afghanistan in the first instance in 2001 is that the Taliban had a consolidated base from which to conduct operations. If that's what's happened again, as is feared, how will that manifest itself over the next few years? Because if the Taliban have metastasized over Western society, what should we? How will that appear, and what should we expect? Will it be as simple as another terror act here or another terror act there, or will it be something a little bit more insidious?
Okay. Fiyaz, would you like to go with either of those?
Can I have a go at your response to your question? Is the Taliban know that they've got clearly no military means to export terrorism. That's the first thing. So they won't go beyond their borders. What they will do are 2 things. The inspiration they provide is the biggest problem. That's the first thing. The second thing, if you notice, I specifically quoted a tweet which talked about anti-Americanism, anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism. That is the resonance bit that's also resonating within Islamist circles. And my experience is we are having members from Islamist groups actually linking with hard left groups in this country. This has been happening for a while. It's been happening for a while. I know it, I've seen it, I've smelt it, I know who they are. And the fact is the legitimization of this narrative, is another strand, as the minister said, in a potpourri of things that are used to radicalize. And so, in a way, the Taliban have many levers. One, subverting theology. Two, being the, quote, only Muslims who've ejected the West. Three, being anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, anti-Western, and read into that anti-Christian, because they'll include that in. So it's the ideological exportation of what the Taliban stand for and what they've achieved, which is the biggest problem for us, I believe.
I'm very conscious of the time. Damian, Hinds, any last comments on those two questions?
So, obviously, well, let me try very quickly to do both. So, first of all, to your point, sir, yeah, I mean, of course, the Americans are the big superpower in the world, and there's China rising up fast behind. And the truth is, they are our number one ally. And yes, they are incredibly important to us. It's incredibly important we work together. We always have to make sure we have something unique to offer, both to the Americans as allies and when we work with other countries, as we also do. And the work we're now doing with Australia, for example, is a good example of that. On the question of how might things manifest in the future, I mean, I think there's a number of different ways in theory that could happen, and we have to be very vigilant against all of them. The straightforward point about people coming from Afghanistan, that can happen. I think, I mean, relatively unlikely for the reasons that Fiyaz said, but again, you have to be very, very vigilant against it. Whenever you've got large movements of people, as we just had in the evacuation from Afghanistan, there will again always be people who seek to use that to their advantage. The second thing is, of course, what happened 20 years ago, what was there 20 years ago, the training camps. And I think these days our technology is better for observing that, for understanding it, and it absolutely is top of the list, along with the human rights issues that Nuz quite rightly went over, to hold the Taliban to account for what they are doing to prevent that happening. And then there is the indirect, the inspired threat, and I think that happens both directly to here in this country, which we've talked about quite a bit. What we haven't talked about so much is the kind of triangulated route through other countries, because there are, in a number of countries in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and elsewhere, groups who, do take in the same way, use these incidents in the same way to further their cause, and that in turn then of course destabilizes more countries and creates more of a global issue. So all of these things we need to be absolutely vigilant against.
Thank you. Could I ask everybody to show their appreciation to our panelists? Thank you and good night.
Thank you.